It's on up there.
Amplify. This is muted.
Oh, okay. I sound better that way.
Yeah.
But south entrance is Zircon. You make the right on Zircon off Mark Shuffle.
Yeah.
While you go east on Zircon, I think it is. Make a left on Prairie Agate.
Yep.
And use like the fourth house on the left,
Oh,
fifth house on the left.
okay. So that's before you get to Bowman.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning, Rudolph.
59 Prairie.
I've got the brown-nosed reindeer. Okay.
Must be Dasher.
Yeah, Dasher. I'm dashing.
Yes, you
All
are.
right. Good morning.
Morning.
So we probably got a bigger Zoom and YouTube audience this morning because they're not here. Or maybe they'll watch it later. All right. We're doing Sacred Gifts and Holy Gatherings this quarter. And today we're going to be doing a generous gift. We'll be looking at the widow who Jesus was watching all the people giving money, and she put in a small amount, but Jesus said she gave more than those giving the large amount. But we'll be comparing, contrasting her with the scribes and the Pharisees. This passage here in the book of Mark appears right after Mark is talking about the actions of the scribes. So, generous gift. This is the first part, gifts to honor God, and looked at the Sabbath, acceptable offerings, dedication of the firstborn, and then a generous gift. So, we're in Matthew chapter 23. We're getting toward the end, toward that final week. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees have been getting together to try and trick Jesus so that he wouldn't have the large following that he did. And but all this was backfiring on them, and all it did was make them look bad.
Can you turn on the speaker?
What's that? Okay. Word from above. All right, so he finally asked them, whose son is the Messiah, and they couldn't answer it. And then after that, nobody asked him any more questions. So now Jesus is going on the offensive here. So Matthew chapter 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, no doubt the crowds included, though, the scribes and the Pharisees. And he says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever...
Can you turn the speakers on? The Zoom people.
We're good? All right.
I guess they can't. I'm not muted. Hello, hello, hello.
We can hear you. Can you see the slides?
Do you see anybody there that you recognize?
Gordon.
Well, is
I'll go. Okay. So
I unmuted it.
they're working on it here. So the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus says here, sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you. So do and observe, those are imperative verbs here. So Jesus, this is a command. Do what they tell you, observe what they tell you. But not the works that they do, for they preach but do not practice. So they're not practicing what they're preaching. A word for that might be hypocrisy. They tie up heavy burdens that are hard to bear, and they lay them on people's shoulders. But these burdens might not be from God's word himself, but they are doing that on their own. but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. So they're not willing to lift a finger to help. So let's look a little bit on these burdens. Whose burdens are these burdens? So they sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you. All right, so Jeremiah 23 talks about burdens. Do they come from the Lord or do they come from somewhere else? Remember, Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem. He was not one of those that got taken into captivity like Daniel and Ezekiel did, but he was back there. He was a prophet to the Jews that were still in Jerusalem. And here's what he says regarding burdens. When one of this people, the Jews, or a prophet or a priest asks you, what is the burden of the Lord? You shall say to them, you are the burden of the Lord, and I will cast you off, declares the Lord. And as for the prophet, priest, or the one of the people who says, the burden of the Lord, I will punish that man and his household. So the Lord is saying, I'm not giving you the burdens. It's these other people, the prophets and the priests, that are putting these burdens upon you, that I haven't put upon you. But the burden of the Lord you shall mention no more. Don't talk about it. For the burden is every man's own word. And you pervert the words of the living God, the Lord of hosts, our God. So Jeremiah says, don't say the burden of the Lord, because it's not the Lord's burden. But is there a burden in following Jesus? Jesus talks about this is Matthew chapter 11, a little bit earlier. He says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, all that work and have these heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's not heavy. My burden is not heavy. It is light. And look at the words here. Those of you with heavy burdens, I'm going to give you rest. I'm gentle. I'm not harsh. My yoke is easy, not burdensome, and my burden is light. So counter from what the burdens you're getting from your scribes and your Pharisees, my burden, God's burden, is light. But the burdens will continue, even going on into the book of Acts. Remember Acts chapter 15, council in Jerusalem. We got these Judaizing, some of the Pharisees became Christians, and they were teaching that you need these Gentiles, first they need to be circumcised, first they need to come into Judaism, then they can become Christians. And now James is talking here. Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we are able to bear? So we weren't able to bear this as Jews. So why are you putting the same burden on these new Christians who are Gentiles? Now what about Moses' seat? What about Moses' seat? Matthew 23, verse 2 is the only mention in Scripture of Moses' seat. Now, if we go back, look at the Pentateuch. These are the books of Moses. The only mention of any seat in the Pentateuch is the mercy seat. It's the gold cover for the Ark of the Covenant. Is this a seat that you want to sit on? No. Those cherubim wings might get in your way, right? Plus, where is this mercy seat located? Holy of Holies. Do you want to go in there? No. So that's the only seat. We talked a little bit last quarter about the tabernacle. That was when we were studying Exodus. And we'll look at all the stuff that they made for the tabernacle. There's no mention of chairs. There were no chairs mentioned in the tabernacle. Now, Moses did sit down when he judged the people. If he had a chair or what, we don't know. Probably. So if you see right here, here's some ruins of a synagogue. And you see the seat up there?
Yeah, is that Moses' seat there?
That is a seat up front. I don't know if it's Moses. Maybe it's called Moses' seat. But that seat was up front, and it was next to where the ark was, where they kept the scrolls. Now we have in Luke chapter 4 where Jesus is handed a scroll, and then he reads from it, he gives it back to the attendant, and then he sits down to teach. So possibly in a seat like that. So that seat was at the front, and it faced the other people who maybe sat on benches or sat on the floor. And then here's a Moses seat from the tabernacle at Corazon. Okay, scribes and the Pharisees. Matthew pretty much puts them together, but were they the same? Scribes and the Pharisees. No. We study what's the difference between a Pharisee and a Sadducees, but we seldom study, well, what's the difference between a scribe and a Pharisees? They actually overlap a little bit. Scribes were called by various names. We'll see that in a later slide. And they were the teachers of the people. This used to be the priests. Up until about the time of the Maccabees, it was the priests that were teaching, but that transitioned then to these people who were experts in the law, the scribes. But remember, Ezra was a scribe and a priest, and he taught in his role as a scribe. Scribes copy the scriptures. So you imagine if you're spending all your day copying scriptures, some of that's got to absorb into you. Whereas the scribes had teaching authority, Pharisees did not. Many were laymen without the knowledge necessary, authority, or responsibility to teach. Now, this authority thing here, remember when Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, how does that end? And when Jesus finished these sayings, the Sermon on the Mount, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. I think what they're talking about here is not that just that he could teach, but when Jesus says, you have heard or you have read, but I say unto you. That's the authority part, him adding or amplifying the scriptures. This was something that the scribes did not do. Matthew is the only writer that mentions Pharisees teaching here and in Matthew 16:12. But keep in mind, Pharisees could be scribes. Many of the scribes were Pharisees. Most of the Pharisees were not scribes, though, and taught in their capacity as scribes, not as Pharisees. And then this is just a note here. We have parallel passages in Mark and Luke to the passage we have here, but neither one of those mention Moses' seat. And interesting part, Matthew covers this in 39 verses. Mark and Luke do it in 3 verses. But Luke talks about scribes and Pharisees in another place, I think Luke chapter 11. He continues, these scribes and Pharisees, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts, and they love the best seats in the synagogues. For those of you in the back, the best seats are up front. That's where they sat. The best seats are up front. We got a brighter projector up here. Right? And as Gordon says, lessons are fresher up here, right?
Yes, they are.
Lessons are fresher up here. Uh-oh, Ralph, he's coming at me with a stick. Was it something I said, brother?
The seats are warmer up here.
Okay. Yeah. I think these seats are actually newer than the ones in the back, aren't they?
They're less used.
They're less used. Okay. All right.
They're original.
They make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Fringes on the end of the garden. Remember the woman with the issue of blood? She said, if I but touch the fringe of his garment. These fringes were actually serve as memory aids in memorizing scripture. And they loved the greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. But you're not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. So in this verse here, it sounds like rabbi and teacher are pretty much synonyms. And if we go to John chapter 1, verse 38, he tells us rabbi. Rabbi is an Aramaic word for teacher. So one and the same. But you are not to be called rabbi. This is Jesus' followers. So here's what the phylacteries look like. The Bible commandment to carry important biblical texts as a sign on hand and forehead was originally meant symbolically, but later, about 2nd century BC, they took this literally. They would do this literally. The phylacteries were tied around the left arm, opposite the heart, and to the forehead. These leather boxes contain 4 biblical passages. We see the 4 there. The second one is the Shema, Hear, O Israel. The last one, Deuteronomy 6:8, that's the verse that tells you to do this, tie these up. And of course, here's the passage from Matthew chapter 23, verse 5. So you see, here's the phylactery up here, and then here's the phylactery here. This is the one. So keep God's word on your mind. Keep God's word in your heart. Mind and heart. Goes along with the Shema. Hear, O Israel, love the Lord, heart, mind, soul, strength. So there we have them. And then here we actually see somebody. He's got it there. He's got it there. And then he's got it here. And he's carrying the scrolls here. And he's saying, hey, dude, you can just get it in the book. Or you can get it on your iPad or iPhone, You don't have to do that. And call no man your father on earth, and you have one Father who is in heaven. Now, I once spoke to a friend who was a Catholic, and I said, why do you call your priest father when Jesus says in Matthew 23:9 that you're not to do that? And he says, oh, that doesn't mean anything, it's just a title. Well, that's what Jesus is talking about here. He's not talking about your biological father. Don't call him a title father. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor. And the word there is kathegetes, and that's just another word for teacher. So we've got a lot of words here. They're all synonyms for teacher. For you have one instructor. The greatest among you shall be your servant. That's counterintuitive, isn't it? And what did Jesus do before the Lord's Supper? Washed those feet, didn't he? The greatest among them, the teacher, the rabbi, the master, washed their feet. He became their servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Again, counterintuitive there. So let's look at that parallel account, and then this will lead in Mark's account to the woman, the 2 mites. So here, we see, beware of the scribes. No mention of Pharisees here, who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces. So, how do people know to greet them in the marketplaces? Well, he's got the long robe on and the fringes, and that guy's important. So they like those greetings in the marketplaces, the agora, as it's called in Acts, and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at seats. You go wearing these long robes, these fringes, your phylactery, and they will seat you right up there front. Who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Nothing wrong with making long prayers, is there?
No,
But-
it doesn't say long sermons.
No making long sermons. Keep in mind, Peter, on the day of Pentecost, you can read through that in 5-10 minutes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. and for pretense make long prayers, they will receive the greater condemnation. So there are levels of condemnation, apparently, and they will receive the greater one. Now, devour widows' houses. I don't think we can take that literally, can we? They don't eat houses. Devour widows' houses. What does that mean? There are several things brought forward. What?
Foreclosed on, took them away.
Foreclosed on them? Yeah, loans. This is from Grant Osborne's Luke verse by verse. Possible, lists 5 interpretations. Abusing the hospitality offered by widows, going to their house, having them feed them when they can't afford it, defrauding widows of their property, stealing their dowries, taking their homes as pledges for loans, and overcharging for legal services. They were lawyers. They would, make sure that the contracts were right when they were doing something. Here's just some names for scribes. Scribes, rabbi, teacher, father. There's that one, call no man your father. And then teacher, and then guide. Pharisees, they were called what kind of guides? Blind guides. Watch out for these blind guides. Here's all these names. They essentially all mean the same thing. So what about the scribes and Jesus? They should be together. Scribes were interpreters of the law. They knew the law. They should be able to see Jesus in the law. Scribes in the New Testament mostly as opponents to Jesus and his teachings. Seldom you'll say, "You have said right, teacher." When they asked him, "Teacher, what's the greatest commandments?" And he told them, he says, "Teacher, you've done right there." They may have been against Jesus because Jesus was teaching. He had all these large crowds. But, he didn't go to the rabbinical schools like they did. So perhaps some jealousy. Jesus taught with authority. Yet when they asked him, "Well, teacher, by what authority do you do these things?" He answers their questions with another question. John the Baptist, was he from God or man? They couldn't answer. He said, "Well, then I'm not going to tell you by what authority." Jesus appeared to reject the oral law, the traditions of the elders that the scribes and Pharisees were big in. He appeared to violate the Sabbath. He didn't give it the respect that that the scribes and Pharisees thought he should. He was forgiving sins. Only God could do that. And he thereby making himself equal with God. Now, early in Jesus' ministry, scribes and Pharisees got together mostly to trip up Jesus and his words, to have people no longer follow him. But that wasn't working. So later, especially after the raising of John the Baptist, after the raising of Lazarus, Jesus got a lot of followers, and then they changed their modus operandi from trying to question him, trying to discredit him. They've decided now one person needs to die for the nation. So now they're trying to kill him, get rid of him that way. So we'll summarize. So we'll end this. So Pharisee distinguished from the scribes. The scribes imposed very strict religious laws on the people while avoiding them for themselves. They knew the workarounds. They knew the loopholes. The scribes built tombs for the prophets, yet condemned to death men sent by God. You notice there it has lists the woes, the 7 woes in Matthew 23. Scribes kept their learning secret. They're learning to teach the people, yet they kept it secret for themselves to elevate themselves. I know more than you do. The scribes had inordinate pride in the way that they're dressed and receiving salutations wherever they went. Now, the Pharisees, Jesus criticized them of hypocrisy, carrying out the laws on purity, outward purity, but inward being impure. They were hypocrites in paying tithes on things that God didn't require tithes on. They required them. Only Luke mentions this, that the Pharisees were lovers of money. And what is it when you love money? Root of all evil, right? Matthew's 5th and 6th woes about traveling to make a proselyte and swearing by the temple, those were not mentioned anywhere by Luke. So, let's go to the widow's offering. Being generous with little. Can you be generous if you don't have much?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. This is widow's offering, Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. And he sat down opposite the treasury, here in the temple, and watched people putting money into the offering box. This is in the court of the women. This is where Jesus did a lot of the teaching, because women could be there, men could be there, and only Jews could be here. We have the court of the Gentiles. Don't have much about Jesus' teaching there. I don't know if we have any. But he taught a lot in the court of the women. And this is where the treasury was. He saw many rich people putting in large sums. Now, he doesn't criticize that. You know, they were rich. They should put in large sums. And large sums, the temple was a very expensive proposition. And you needed them. You needed those large sums. And then, counter to that, he sees a poor widow, and she puts in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. Now, the word there is 2 lepta. This is a bronze coin. So we got silver coin, we got gold, we got silver, we got copper, and then we got bronze. So she put in the value of, of course, they only used coinage, paper money. But the value of the coinage, of course, was determined by how precious the metal was. So hers were, this says 2 small copper coins, but we'll see a picture of that, which make a penny. And he calls his disciples to them. Now, he's the only one that's watching them, watching the widow. The disciples, that just goes on all the time, people putting money in there. If they're putting in these large sums, silver coins into these containers, that's going to make a lot of sound. Hers, you could barely discern these 2 small coins going into those coffers. He calls his disciples to him, and he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box." They're probably wondering, excuse me? They're putting in more. And then he gives the reason why. For they have contributed out of their abundance. Nothing wrong with that. They should. They've been blessed. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on. She put in.
Was this her daily allowance?
What she put?
Received from others.
I'm wondering, or perhaps she did some, perhaps she worked on some claws or something, like Dorcas or somebody there, and made some money that way. But here we have the area, here's the court of the women, this area right in here. And then around it were 13 coffers, 13 areas where you could put money into the treasury. Or we'll get, not all of them are the same. Not all of them are the same. They were marked what your offering was for. Can you imagine back there, like we have an offering for various things, for salaries, for fixing the boiler? That would have got a lot of money a couple of weeks ago, wouldn't it? So they were marked according to what they were. So this is here's a model of what the court of the women looked like. Here's these stairs we talked about last week, going up to the gate of Nicanor Gate, where Mary and Joseph would presented their offering. But quite a large area. They added this later on, an upper area for the women. But then these offering places, these containers, these shofars, were right in here. And then Jesus saw this woman giving this amount. So, Picture this widow in your mind. What would she have looked like? Something like that? Putting in the 2 small coins? What about her? She's younger, isn't she?
Yes.
Now there's a child here. I don't think this is actual, otherwise you would have said she put in everything that they had to live on. But he says she was a poor widow. Are there any age restrictions on being a widow? You can be a widow the day after you get married. But there she is. So we don't know about her age. So I don't think we have to worry about her starving to death. She was at the temple. God's people were given special charge to care for the widows and orphans. All those verses there, care for widows. In the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch, care for widows is linked with care for orphans and care for strangers. Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 24, when you reap your harvest, this is, remember, like gleaning. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you should not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the foreigner, the stranger, the fatherless, the orphan, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So don't go back to get the sheaf. Next verse. Don't go back to get more olives. Next verse. Don't go back to get more grapes. So sheaf, olives, and grapes. Leave them behind for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. Now, last week, remember we talked about Anna and Simeon? There was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, so she was elderly, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. Now, say people got married earlier back. Say she got married 16. She became a widow at 23. So she was probably there doing what that other woman did. She did not depart from the temple. She stayed at the temple. She would be taken care of at the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. Now, fasting is not eating, but generally it doesn't really count if you can't afford the food, does it? Well, I'm fasting. I'm starving. Hey, I'm fasting. Well, you wouldn't be if you had the money to buy the food, but she did that. But she, from the time, say, she was 23 till 84, the Lord was taking care of her, the temple. And we see an example of this here, Acts chapter 6, verse 1. In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their disciples were being overlooked in the daily distribution. They gave out food every day. And we're talking about Christians here, but I think this is a carryover from the temple. The temple was doing the same thing. So perhaps early on, the Christians were also, as long as they were Jews, they were also getting this food. But later on, the Christians then had their own system where they would take care of that. But there was a daily distribution of food. Happened every day. So there's the coin, has a bronze lepton. A little hard to read. The widow, Mark 12, gave 2 lepta coins, bronze, each worth a pruta. What one coin would buy, I think they could have given a more practical. So for 2 coins, she could have purchased 2 baths at a Roman bathhouse. But I don't think that was a priority. Maybe a loaf of bread, hopefully, or something like that. Probably a little hard to read, but there were those 13 shofar. 13 containers. Each of them had a different, well, 7 of them were the same. 1 and 2, new shekels and old shekels. New shekels if you're given a contribution that's due now. Old shekels is, well, you didn't pay last year, so you're going to put it in there. Bird offerings, young birds, wood for the altar. Donate for that. Frankincense, that's part of a grain offering. You put frankincense on there. Gold for the mercy seat on 6. And then for free will offerings, there were 7 of them. Talked last week about the passage where Luke says that she made the offering of a turtle dove or young pigeons. And I said, where did he get the young pigeons? Since that's not specified in the Old Testament. But if you look there, one of the offerings was for young birds for a burnt offering. These are for young pigeons. So he has young pigeons because that's when you go to the temple and buy pigeons, you will get young pigeons. And that's where Luke got that from. How about another woman, another widow? She was even in worse shape. She gave to the Lord. Here's a passage well known, but in truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up for 3 years and 6 months. And a great famine came over all the land, and Elijah was sent to none of them. No Jews. He wasn't sent to any Israelites, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. This woman was in far worse shape than the one in the passage. Elijah predicts a drought. This is where we're first introduced to Elijah. We have nothing about the Lord calling Elijah. He just comes upon the scene here in 1 Kings 17. Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead. He's on the other side. He's on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And he said to Ahab, this is the king of the northern kingdom, king of Samaria, as the Lord of God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him. So he comes to Ahab, presents this message. We're not even sure if Ahab knows who is this guy. What's he saying? Does he think he's God? And then he leaves. He leaves. He says this and then he leaves. The Lord tells him to depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook of Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. Turns out this is close to where he lives. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So God's going to take care of him. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook of Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So he's got bread, he's got meat, he's got water. Looks like he's taken care of. And after a while, the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, arise, go from Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. He's being fed by ravens, and now he's being fed by a widow. Why a widow? It seems like she'd have a hard time taking care of herself. But that's what happens. So here we have, so here's Tishbe where he's from, and here's the creek, Cherith there. And then he's going up here to Zarephath. And look what we got there. Sidon. He's going to the place where they worship Baal and Ashtaroth. And who's from Sidon? And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk, Ahab to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. So it's interesting, he sends him to the homeland of Jezebel and helping out a widow there. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called her and said, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. Okay. We're going to see how sad this actually was. The next slide. Does this woman have that? And she said, as the Lord, whose God? Your God. Her God was Baal. As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. That's it, little bit. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. She's at the end of her rope here. And he's telling, make something for me. And Elijah said to her, do not fear, go and do as I have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. That's got to be a lot of faith, isn't it? From a man she's never met, serving a God she doesn't know. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. So it happened. Everything happened as he said. She was taken care of, she and her son. What says her household, so maybe there were others there. Maybe she had some other relatives that were also being fed. So this happened until they got rain. So if God could keep the jar of flour and jug of oil from emptying, why couldn't he keep the brook from drying up?
Didn't want to.
Yep. He had someplace else for him to go, didn't he? Can you imagine sleeping by that brook? This way he can go sleep in a bed, you know. He can be more comfortable, and he can help some poor widow there. Others giving generously. What about the brethren in Macedonia? They weren't wealthy, were they? No. Encouragement to give generously, 2 Corinthians 8. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given to the churches of Macedonia. That's Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part.
It's interesting that abundance and poverty are in the same sentence.
The abundance of their poverty. You know, they didn't have much. In fact, I don't think Paul even asked them to give. Remember, there's the problem in Jerusalem. They were collecting because of the famine.
Now he says they did not do as we expected. In other words, they weren't looking for anything.
Yeah. For they gave according to their means, I can testify, and beyond their means. Beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking a part in the relief. They begged that they could help. Paul knew they couldn't afford it, but they begged. And thus, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Remember when Paul was having difficulty? You know, Philippi, which was a poor congregation, helped him out. Next week, a bride worth waiting for. Jacob and Rachel. A different Rachel.
Yeah.
All right. So was she a bride worth waiting for? Okay. All right. All right. So that'll be next week. So next week's a new section, 4 weddings and a funeral. 4 weddings and a funeral. So this will be the first wedding.
Excellent, thank you, Warren.
There you go.
It's warmer up here.